often those kids that contribute at the end have the most interesting things to say, because they've done what the kids who were like me when I was in school, who talk, which is maybe why I'm an English teacher. We've already said a lot, right? But they've actually listened and they've processed and they've thought about that. And then when it was like, oh, wait, where did that come from? And then you as the teacher can say, hey, like, don't wait to the 18th minute. Like, this conversation would have been so much better if you bring that up earlier.
Hi, I'm Annalisa from Parlay, and I chatted with Cody about how he runs Parlay discussions in his English classes. We talked about prepping students for discussion, setting goals, and teaching essential social skills like body language and maintaining eye contact when you have a device in front of you. We covered a lot of ground, so use the timestamps to skip ahead to the points you find most interesting. Hope you enjoy.
Overall, I think it would be interesting for you to kind of just kick off and share a little bit more about how you use Parlay. You were at the high school, now it's middle school, so I'm sure it'll be a little different, but I'm sure there's some similarities as well. So where in the course of your courses do you actually put discussions? How often do you run them? And what's the main value of running discussions in your courses?
As far as when I do the conversations, it really can be at any point. Beginning, middle, or end. In the beginning, I really value it for anticipation guide discussions, where if you're studying a certain text or studying a certain theme, to see where they're at before. And now with the follow-up feature, right, you don't have to create a separate assignment. You can then just revisit from 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, however long you've been working on the unit. And then really, at the end is such a powerful opportunity as well, because they can synthesize all the material that they've learned and the conversations that they've had. So I think I really love the fact that with the written portion, a lot of LMSs have discussion boards built into their system, but Parlays is just so much better at cultivating rich conversations. The recent addition of the AI feature, which came out at some point towards the middle to end of last year, to me was such a game changer. But the ability for the AI to process all of the submissions and then follow up with a rich conversation based upon what the students in my actual class want to talk about and did talk about is one of the most powerful features. I think, for example, I really enjoy challenging students. I think the art of asking meaningful questions themselves is very beneficial. And so you can go online and there's plenty of sites with Bloom's taxonomy of all the different verbs and question stems that function like light switches to activate, higher levels of thinking. And so to just create a prompt where you say, hey, submit 3 or 4 questions. And then more importantly, well, one, you can have the students respond to that by itself. But then when you add the AI onto it on top of it and you click follow up, I don't have to physically look through every single sticky note that would have come to me prior. And, if 6 of them are asking a question about a certain character's decision, it will figure that out, deduce that, and then phrase it in an insightful and intelligent way. So it saves me a lot of time in that regard. Something I started doing last year, primarily with my 9th grade students, was I set up certain goals. So I would say, hey, this is more of an end of unit thing, I suppose. We're going to have a 40-minute, 30-minute seminar, and I would write up on the board, goals. We're going to start on Parlay. We're going to go 20 minutes on Parlay. By the end of 20 minutes, I need X percentage of participation, which you monitor in real time. I need to hear at least 3 or 4 direct references to the text, or, whatever those criteria are. And then I'm kind of checking them off as I go through. And 20 minutes into the conversation, because of the verbal roundtable that Parlay has, the conversation's already rich. But then what I did last year, not all the time, but enough times to discuss it now, is I would say, okay, let's just close our computers now and let's go for another 10 minutes without any technology. And so to literally within the same activity, blend both the incredibly irreplaceable tools that Parlay has and then interact just as humans without tech. You're sitting around the campfire having a conversation. That to me was probably the best conversations, where it was a blend within a blend.
That is so interesting. Do you find that there's a shift, or do you find that once their kind of momentum is going with the conversation, that's when it's kind of beneficial to kind of just let it go organically? Is that what you're finding?
So it's tough, because the students that I had last year, and they were in the minority, who didn't like using Parlay,
Mhm.
which is going to be, no matter what ed program you have, there are always going to be students that don't like it. We're pretty typically the loudmouth students who dominated the conversation without the computer. So, student X who has no qualms about participating didn't like Parlay because he or she couldn't just interject and talk louder and interrupt. So it's like the very skills that I want them to learn. The quieter, shyer students typically enjoyed it even more because they knew they didn't have to raise their hand. They didn't have to be called on. It was just part of that. The negative, though, because there's always positives and negatives to everything, the negative of having the computers closed down is some students are like, well, no, now I don't have the ability to type down my notes.
Right.
And then the negative for me is I couldn't send them those nudges, those quick, like, hey, really, and it would be nudges of not just to like participate, but also nudges to commend them on non-participatory tasks that they were doing, like maintaining eye contact or, good body posture. Hey, Annalisa, great job following the conversation with your eyes. Thanks. And you would like literally see them like point to each other and be like, look what I got. And so when he'd close the computer down, you can't do that anymore. So I think really what I did a couple of times was say, okay, we're not going to use the cue. We're not going to use the, Parlay calling on you anymore. And if you want to get a break from your screen, go at it, close it up, turn it off, take a notebook out if you want or don't. But if you want to still use it, go ahead and keep your screen open.
I'm curious because that's actually a question that a lot of people ask with Parlay. It's kind of a big hesitation people have is, oh, we want to maintain these social skills, these eye contact, kind of body language, all of that. How do you get ahead of that? And what do you find kind of works best to really focus on what people are saying and making that eye contact?
It's one of the 4 core elements to my classroom that I got from one of my colleagues at one of my schools. And sit up, lean in, phones away, maintain eye contact, ask questions, and be involved. And so there's like a little poster in my room that has that eye contact, and I bring it up, at the beginning of the school year, but then also repeatedly throughout because, if you look at society and its lack of skills in conversation and just resorting to yelling and screaming at each other, which, adults unfortunately model way too frequently for children, that, knowing that, if the conversation is happening, that you should be able to walk into a room and, with earplugs in and not be able to hear anything, but know where the conversation is because most people should be looking in that direction. And so, it is sometimes a little bit challenging with their computers, but they can always then kind of like put their screens just a little bit down. And if they want to tap in, but it's also, an important skill in the 21st century to, have this laptop that I'm looking at right now and also be able to look at people. So I think it provides the opportunity to practice that really important skill. If you think about faculty meetings or, meetings outside of education, I'm not in the corporate world, but I imagine that there are probably meetings where people come and their laptops are open, right? And they still have to have meetings. So, there's definitely the benefit of putting the computer away, but there's also a very important benefit of having the computer open. And I think the ability to nudge students silently without me interjecting and disrupting the flow of the conversation is the most valuable, because some schools don't have the opportunity to have a program where you can see all the screens at one time. So to know that I sent it to, John, and whatever the compliment is, or the critique, right? It can be either or, hey, John, I see that your phone's out. Please put it in your pocket, appreciate it. Or, whatever that is, you're not embarrassing the student. You're not stopping the conversation. And usually for the good ones, again, they're like nudging then each other. And then you can kind of almost see the next person try to model the behavior that was complimented by me.
Yeah. Oh, that's so awesome. Kind of mentioned a lot of these things at the beginning of the year in terms of body language and what's expected.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other things that you prepare them with or that you expect from students at the beginning of the year and preparing them for discussion?
It's those 4 core principles, which, I mentioned before. And I think it's the ability to be sincere with the students and make sure that they recognize that they're valued and that their voices matter and that you listen to them. I think that something I'm going to try to do more than I've ever done in my past years of teaching is to have more conferences with my students, where I'm hoping to meet with them at least once every 2 weeks, if not once every week. And so I think like building that relationship within the classroom between teacher and student, I would anticipate, because I haven't done it yet, create a positive value where they're going to know that I care about what they think, and they're going to know that I care about what every person thinks. Therefore, when we have the seminars and the discussions, that we'll be able to, do that effectively.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was looking at some of your discussions from last year, and it looks like you had pretty strong participation rates. Do you notice that it's that strong at the beginning of the year? Or does it take some time for those final few students to jump into the conversation
For
and
the
feel
verbal, you
comfortable
mean?
joining? Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, it depends on how long your conversation is going to be, right? If you're not going to have a seminar, but imagine if you had a seminar in 1 minute, you can't get 100%, you can't get 25 kids in a minute. So it really depends. Like sometimes I would only have 10 minutes, sometimes it'd be 20, sometimes it'd be 25, right? So the longer the time, the higher the participation that you would expect. And I think the highest participation rate that I put in was probably about 80 that I would expect, because you don't want it to get to a point where 24 kids have talked, so you have 96 participation rate, and that like one kid who doesn't talk, and you don't want then that it becomes like a negative pressure. When I look at the clock and we haven't gotten there, I'll quickly open up the tab that allows me to see who hasn't talked, and then just type up a please contribute, or some verbiage like that, and then quickly copy paste, send to each of those students. For me, some teachers are probably a lot better at the assessment of verbal conversations. Whether it's a flaw of mine or just who I am as a teacher, I almost just get so interested in what's being said that for me to then and even though Parlay has wonderful tools that if you can do this, do it, and I'm jealous of you, but I get so immersed in what they're trying to say and doing the nudges that for me to like fill in, a 5 out of 5 or a 4 out of 5. So typically what I'll do is, or at least what I did last year primarily, was if the assignment was worth X points, I made half of those points a shared team grade. So say 20, right? So, hey, everybody, to earn 10 out of the points, the class needs to X, Y, and Z. And as the clock is getting closer and we haven't gotten there, I would remind them of that. Hey, we need 2 more people. And then you can kind of see them like nudging, like, and a lot of times the kids have great ideas. They're just too nervous to share. I found that as the year went on, that kind of did dissipate a bit. That number of kids that were so reticent to share did shrink. But you would see, a student like nudge her neighbor, friend, like, come on, share. And I don't know how other teachers across the country and world feel, but often those kids that contribute at the end have the most interesting things to say, because they've done what the kids who were like me when I was in school, who talk, which is maybe why I'm an English teacher. We've already said a lot, right? But they've actually listened and they've processed and they've thought about that. And then when it was like, oh, wait, where did that come from? And then you as the teacher can say, hey, like, don't wait to the 18th minute. Do that. Like, this conversation would have been so much better if you bring that up earlier. So I would give them, and so on a few occasions, the class didn't get there. And because it's so few and so infrequent that they don't get to those shared realistic goals, if it does happen, the kids that have participated, I don't ding them, right? They get their full credit, and then I'll take, an appropriate deduction from the students who sat there and did nothing. But then the equally important part is, because I don't want the whole entire class to just sink or swim together all the time, is I'll give them a reflection assignment that's sometimes it's on Parlay, but it's usually just a shared Google Doc, because it is a very private thing, where I'll say, hey, out of whatever, what score do you deserve for your participation and why, right? And they kind of know that if they said nothing and I had to reprimand them several times, if they give themselves a 5 out of 5, that's going to create a really awkward conversation. So, the students are generally pretty awkward, honest. Hey, I deserve a 2, or I deserve a 3. And I'll ask them to, record a highlight of something that happened. So what was something that you heard from someone? And I'll then often like go through and say, and, Maisie, you got this comment, or Jack, you got this comment, or, whoever it is, props to you. And then, what can we do to improve? So that's how it kind of like to try to to grade them both as a class, but then within the assigned assignment, give them a reflective piece. And more time, the vast majority of the time, they're more honest than they are trying to give themselves 100% if they don't deserve it.
You put a big emphasis on exploring everyone's individual ideas, even if they don't come until right at the end of the discussion. And you ran that kind of class poll, which I thought was super interesting, where you asked the class, how open was our class to exploring everyone's ideas and perspectives? And the one that I wanted to bring up that I personally thought was really, really interesting, and I'm curious to hear what you think about this statement and the results of the survey. At the end of our class discussions on Parlay, I want the conversation to keep going. And most students in your classes had said that they really wanted the conversation to keep going. Presumably, they wanted the class to be a bit longer so that they can continue the conversation. I thought that was so, so powerful, especially for high school and especially for English. What did you think about that? What do you notice with students? And do you think they would have said that at the beginning of the year? Do you think that it takes that comfort with discussions to actually get to a point where they really just want to keep listening to each other's ideas and be a part of it?
I don't know. I think that presumably that number would be higher at the end of the year than the beginning of the year. And I think it's important to have conversations that are meaningful and not just have conversations for conversation's sake, to provide them meaningful, intellectually engaging questions that relate to your curriculum are really, really important. And if you, as I mentioned earlier, right, I think if I were to do Parlay every single day, I don't think that would have a positive result on that survey and the overall learning environment. So it's, hopefully conversation of some form is taking place every day, but to use it judiciously to me is very, very key. I think that building off of like a lot of times, well, I guess now that there is that follow-up feature, I might be changing it some, but last year and the years that I've used it in the past, where you do a written conversation, and I'm a big fan. I'd say most of the written conversations I use the anonymous feature, not all the time, but I think that there was a class I had last year where a couple of students would always challenge a different specific student's responses, and not in any like overtly terrible way that I had to like intervene right away, but it was like, oh, well, she just said something, I bet so-and-so is going to respond and disagree. And so that student came up to me at the end of a written conversation, a seminar, and said, hey, do you know who agreed with me today? And didn't know that it was me that he was agreeing with me, right? And so that brings up one of the main features that I love about Parlay is just that anonymous feature, where if you think about our world, right, and the polarization and the different lenses that people have, that you see something on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, you see who it's from, and automatically you have your prejudices. Versus here, it's somebody in the class, right? But it allows people to evaluate the idea, not the person. And that, use of that feature is, to me, almost, impossibly beneficial. Like, you have to have that. And so that, I think, allows the students to really engage. So if they write and they respond first, whether it's a homework assignment or an in-class assignment, and then they have those verbal conversations, well, it's because there's already been buy-in, right? And I would anticipate with the follow-up feature that you all introduced towards the end of the last school year, that to be able to see like this thread of 3 to 5 to 6 different things, and the thoughts, build and grow and change, hopefully will be a really positive feature. So, I think kids want to talk, and as teachers, we need to create the environment that allows them to talk, where when the bell rings or the time's over, they are frustrated because they are learning and they are talking. And most students in my career who have valued my course, when they come back, it's not the book that we read, although sometimes it is. It's more, oh, I miss those conversations. I miss those discussions.
Yeah. And I'm sure that ties to, like you said, the fact that you really want it to be meaningful and you're trying to make sure the conversations are deeply connected to their own lives. How do you make discussions meaningful? How do you make sure that you're kind of on the right track and you're keeping it really engaging?
So if it's a conversation you're having towards the end of a given unit, being mindful of what, and sometimes I'll write it down. Sometimes you just kind of like file it away in your brain of what sparked interest throughout the unit, and then designing your own questions to hit on those things that have already worked. I think playing to particular themes that are relevant for whatever age you're teaching in, whether it's 9th, 12th, 8th, whatever grade. That's helpful. I think that creating an environment where they're excited to learn. I mean, it sounds silly and stupid, but it's important is something that is necessary. And collaborating, right? Talking to my colleagues has been very beneficial, especially if I haven't taught something before and I know somebody's taught something for a few years. Hey, what's worked, right? Coming up with good essential questions, I think are paramount, where if you have a good essential question to frame the unit, then it doesn't matter what you read in the unit. It's that question that's important. It's, for Julius Caesar, what is an effective leader? It takes on so many different roles. And I think that, giving them the practice to create their own questions results in a ton of buy-in and positivity. Because if I'm answering something that I created and my teacher is telling me that this is good thinking, well, that's probably more meaningful than being like, all right, let's answer numbers 1 to 10 on the worksheet.
So where are you doing that kind of process of having them create their own questions? And are you doing that on Parlay, or are they kind of just
You can do it on
coming up with
Parlay.
it?
You don't have to use it on Parlay. Like I just have a Bloom's taxonomy that I Googled Bloom's taxonomy of verbs, and then I'll model, so in the beginning of the year, if I've known that they've read X, the prior year, giving them a good evaluative question where that one of those verbs from that evaluative chart is in there. So sort of coaching and teaching them how to create those questions. If you want to do it without computers, right, it's as an individual, as a partnership, as a triad, whatever it might be, create 3, write them down on a sticky note, come up and turn them into me. And then I sit and I put them in front of me, and sometimes I'll be like, all right, give me a number from 1 to 10. And then I look and I'll pick one of the 3 that's the best one, and I'll ask it to them in a non-Parlay environment. But then when you bring that into the Parlay environment, they could just type up those questions, and you can use the AI genie to then, read them all for you. But if you've done all of the work in creating the questions and having the conversation, in informal, non-graded settings, then, if you use Parlay for a more formalized thing, and you don't have to, obviously, like you can just use Parlay to have a good talk, that they've had the practice to create the questions, and good conversations need good questions, right? Whether that's in school, whether that's in work, or if you're sitting around the campfire with your friends at night and, hey, there goes 2 hours where you're just talking. Well, why did that happen? Well, somebody asked a really good question or made a really good comment or it's just life skills that have educational and vocational value.
Was there anything else that you wanted to kind of touch on or mention, or any even feedback?
Yeah,
from the
there
Parlay team?
was one thing, I forget what question you asked me, so what would it fall under, but something that I found very helpful in the conversations is when the conversations at any point, rather 2 minutes in, 10 minutes in, at the very, very end, is, unless it's just like on autopilot and you're sitting back doing nothing because the students are incredible, which happens, but not all the time, pausing and letting them talk in their groups. When I usually do the verbals, they're in a big circle. I probably will continue that, but one thing I'm interested to change is maybe like right now, my current room structure has pods of 3 throughout. So I might see what a verbal one is like when they're in their pods and they're not. And then like pause, talk in your triads about X for the next minute. Nobody's parlaying. Like you can add to your notes if you want, but to give them that time in the conversation to just talk rather than having to wait for one person. Because like one of the criticisms that some of the students brought up is, like, I'll tap in and I'll say something, but by the time I get to talk again, the conversation's already changed. So letting them have that 30 to 60 or whatever seconds, they could bring something back up and not feel like their thoughts have been stifled. So that's something that I think works quite effectively.
Yeah, I really like that idea. I've heard of one other teacher doing something like that, where she'll maybe pivot or switch between whole group conversations and then smaller pod conversations, kind of like a turn and talk style,
Yes.
just to make sure
Yes.
your quieter students are getting those reps and to actually be able to speak up, and maybe
Right.
they'll feel more comfortable jumping into the whole class as well. So
Yep.
that's super engaging, and I'm sure it would be great to try it with 8th grade. I think that makes a lot of sense. So that's really cool.